And in fact, you've shared about the loss of your first wife
Yes.
to cancer.
Well, that was the other situation that sort of tipped me over into a whole new understanding. My wife had a diagnosis of cancer in December of 1981 with the expectation of maybe 2 years to live at most. And a lot of prayer groups were formed across New Jersey, well beyond the boundaries of the Episcopal Church, and I appreciated that because that's a love gift. These people were saying, we care about you, we care about your wife, we want to somehow do something for you, be with you in this crisis. You accept that graciously. My wife lived 6.5 years, not 2 years. Mm-hmm. And as she passed the 2-year boundary, which was quite in the public domain, you can't be in public life and have private life at the same time. You learned that already, I'm sure. But as it passed the 2-year time limit, the prayer groups began to take credit for it as if their prayers were actually curing her or pushing back the disease. It was almost as if it were a battle between God and Satan, and they were on God's side, and Satan was being pushed back because these God-fearing people were praying. Again, without meaning to be pejorative and with deep appreciation for the love that was expressed in that, I couldn't help but wonder if God really would operate that way, if God would allow my wife to live 6.5 years instead of 2 years, because lots of people prayed for her, because I was a well-known public figure in New Jersey. And I thought, suppose a garbage collector in downtown Newark, which is America's poorest per capita city, had a wife who had cancer, but nobody knew this garbage collector. He was not a public figure. So nobody prayed for his wife, or at least few people did, maybe 1 or 2 that might know him intimately. But there wouldn't be this massive outpouring. Mm-hmm. Would God respond less well to that? Do many prayers from people who are about someone who's well known change God's mind and make God alleviate pain or allow life? I just can't imagine God saying, well, I'm getting a lot of prayers about the bishop's wife, so let's give her an extra 4 years, and nobody's praying for this garbage collector's wife, so let her die quickly. I can't imagine that. And if I could imagine that, I would become an atheist. Mm-hmm. If that's the way God operates, I want no part of that kind of manipulative deity. Now, that forces you to make some brand new understandings of prayer. Mm-hmm. I don't even like the word anymore. I pray every day of my life, but I don't use the word prayer. I use the word meditation or contemplation. I think that prayer time is sitting or standing self-consciously in the reality of the transcendent dimension we call God, getting in touch with it, letting it fill your life so that you can begin to operate out of it. And as you operate out of it, you begin to live the life of prayer rather than do the activity of prayer. When St. Paul said that we are to pray without ceasing, he surely didn't mean we are to say prayers without ceasing. When people envision the kingdom of heaven as a place where people are praying all the time, I'd just as soon not go, if that's the reality that you've got to deal with. Now, how do you take that God energy that I believe is real and make it effective? Well, in the first place, human beings can't make God's energy effective. All we can do is channel it. But how do you channel it? It seems to me that you're in touch with it and that you live out of it, and you become an agent for life, for love, and for the enhancement of being. And you do it in your physical life, but you never deny that the thoughts and the love that flow out of you mentally toward those who are absent from you might not still be effective. I don't know how that would work, but as I said yesterday, I'm impressed with the fact that when people talk to their plants grow better. Now that sounds a little spooky and weird, but it seems to me that there's something about energy flowing from a human being to another human being, or even to an inanimate creature like a plant. There's something that we don't yet understand about how love connects us, how life is bound together, how we are far more interdependent than we think. And I'm at the place where I'm trying to understand that that's how God operates. God is not an IBM machine in the sky that I program so that you'll get an email. God is the very relationship that binds us together, and somehow we open ourselves to that, and that can be an effective way of loosing God's power in the world. And I believe God's power, which is love and life, is always beneficial, always enhancing, and even therapeutic. Does that mean that that'll make the difference in life and death. No, I think there's something pretty inexorable. I've never known prayer to heal a person with a pancreas cancer diagnosis, for example, because medical science does not have a cure for pancreas cancer. So that you know, I don't know anything that could do at that point except surround the person with love so that they can walk through the death experience without being alone, and I don't minimize what that gift is. The fact is we're all going to die. And I think there's some parts of our prayer routine that indicate that maybe some of us think if we pray long enough and hard enough, we might not die. I'm always amused at those advertisements that come on radio or TV about some drug, say Zopar, and they'll say 1 out of every 4 people will die of coronary disease. The sort of implication is the other 3 aren't going to die of something else. You know, we really need to be realistic about that. Death is not our enemy. I think Paul was dead wrong. Death is our friend. Death is our shadow. Death is what gives life its meaning. You walk with death every day of your life, and ultimately you put your hand in the hand of death and you depart this world. And somehow we don't seem to have that relationship correct. I don't think hell exists. I happen to believe in life after death, but I don't think it's got a thing to do with reward and punishment. Religion is always in the control business, and that's something people don't really understand. It's in the guilt-producing control business. And if you have heaven as a place where you're rewarded for your goodness and hell as a place where you're punished for your evil, then you sort of have control of the population. And so they create this fiery place, which has quite literally scared the hell out of a lot of people throughout Christian history. And it's part of a control tactic.
But wait a minute, you're saying that hell, the idea of a place under the earth or somewhere where you're tormented for an eternity, is actually an invention of the church?
I think the church fired its furnaces hotter than anybody else. But I think there's a sense in most religious life of reward and punishment in some form. The church doesn't like for people to grow up, because you can't control grown-ups. That's why we talk about being born again. When you're born again, you're still a child. The people don't need to be born again. They need to grow up. They need to accept their responsibility for themselves and the world.
What do you make of the theology, which is quite prominent these days in America, which is that there is one guaranteed way not to go to hell, and that is to accept Jesus as your personal Savior?
Yeah, I grew up in that tradition. Every church I know claims that we are the true church, and they have some ultimate authority. We have the infallible Pope, we have the inerrant Bible. The idea that the truth of God can be bound in any human system, by any human creed, by any human book, is almost beyond imagination for me. I mean, God is not a Christian. God is not a Jew or a Muslim or a Hindu or a Buddhist. All of those are human systems which human beings have created to try to help us walk into the mystery of God. I honor my tradition. I walk through my tradition. But I don't believe my tradition defines God. I think it only points me to God. You and I are emerging people, not fallen people. Our problem is not that we are born in sin. Our problem is we do not yet know how to achieve being fully human. The function of the Christ is not to rescue the sinners, but to empower you and to call you to be more deeply and fully human than you've ever realized there was the potential within you to be. Maybe salvation needs to be conveyed in terms of enhancing your humanity rather than rescuing you from it. Life is a startling and wondrous experience. And eventually, I think we're going to discover that God is unfolding through the life of our consciousness and our self-consciousness, and is not a parent figure up in the sky. But I believe because I'm related to something that is not bound by time and space, that I will share in whatever God's eternity is.
Now, you've written a very provocative book that's going to offend many in the church, because what you're talking about is what you call the terrible texts, basically how a literal interpretation of the Bible has been used historically and up to this day to justify persecution, denigration of certain groups. Why are you focusing on this right now?
Well, I think, first of all, you need to be honest about our history. And secondly, as I look at my country today, I find the Bible being used to justify almost every evil that you can imagine. You know, the Bible was used to justify the war in Iraq. The Bible is used to justify keeping breathing cadavers alive 15 years after they cease to have any mental function. The Bible is being used to ban gay marriage from the Constitution of the United States, which had put discrimination into the Constitution for the first time in its history. And the Bible is used to justify executing prisoners. I find it really difficult. I grew up in a world where the Bible was used to justify segregation, superiority of men to women, superiority of Christianity to other religions, so that you could actually hate other religions because they were infidels. I really think we've got to get beyond that.
The rise of fundamentalism in the current context is interesting, and you make a point that September 11th and the prospect of international terrorism unto itself forces Christians to confront the same kind of religious bigotry and zealotry that they in fact perpetuated historically. Talk to me about that.
Yeah, the only good thing that I can think of that happened after about 9/11 is that it forced us to recognize that we were being attacked by another religion that regarded us as infidels. That's exactly what we did in the Crusades. We organized invading armies. The Pope organized them. And we marched into the Holy Land and we killed Muslims indiscriminately, a lot more than 3,000. And some of those didn't even get to the Holy Land, and they kept looking for infidels on the way, and the only ones they could find were the Jews, so they killed them on the way. And it even got to the place in the Crusades where they began to kill those loyal to the Patriarch of Constantinople, the Orthodox tradition, because they weren't loyal to the Pope. It's that kind of tribal mentality that was so deep in the heart of Christianity, and I think it's still there, and we've got to expunge it.
Well, I want to get to that, but first, I mean, we should give our viewers a little bit better sense of what you're writing about here and the kind of scriptures that you're analyzing. First, in terms of the role of women, I mean, you write that in many ways the organized church may be the most sexist institution extant in modern society.
Well, I think that's true.
How has the Bible been used to kind of subvert the role of women in society?
Well, in the first place, in the oldest creation story, we're told that God created the man, Adam, in God's image. And then when the man was lonely, God created all the animals to be friends to the man, and none of them were quite adequate. And so God takes a rib from Adam's side and creates Eve, who is above the animals but not in the image of God. And she becomes the male companion, and her role for existence is that she's to serve the needs of the man. And there is another creation story, but that's the oldest one, and that's the one that Paul picks up when he begins to talk about the relationship of men and women. So it enters the Christian faith. And then you have Paul saying things like, I forbid a woman to have authority over a man. And women were actually treated as property in the Hebrew tradition. Polygamy means that I, as a man, can have as many wives as I can afford, because wives are property. And so you've got that bedrock. Now, if you look at the history of the Western world, I don't know about Canada, but in the United States, women couldn't vote until 1920. That's that's not 100 years ago. Women had a harder time getting votes than the freed slaves.
This isn't just Christianity, though. I mean, this runs through all religions.
There's a misogyny across the world, and part of it is that we always conceive of God as male. And so the male becomes the image of God. In the great traditions of Roman Catholicism and Greek Orthodoxy, a woman cannot be a priest today because they say the priest must represent God before the altar, and the woman is somehow defective.
Is that the biblical rationale for not allowing female priests?
Yeah, I think that's, if you scratch it, that's where it comes down to. You know, you have arguments. John Paul II on one occasion said, the church will never ordain women because Jesus didn't have any female disciples. Well, in the first century, a woman was so circumscribed she couldn't go out in public. So there was no way Jesus could have had disciples. But I respond to that by saying, Holy Father, he didn't have any Polish males either, and yet we've abandoned the strict literalism.
But you do believe that Mary Magdalene was probably Jesus' wife?
I think that's I'm glad Dan Brown
Yeah, so
put
Da
that
Vinci's
into the
Code,
public
that's right.
arena so that everybody can discuss it. I said that in 1992, but it didn't get widely noticed outside the church. Yeah, I think there's a strong tradition that the relationship between Jesus and Magdalene has been repressed by the church because they were frightened of it, and Dan Brown plays on that theme. But if you
I think
look
there's
at
historical evidence that it was Pope Gregory, wasn't it, who actually propagated the whole notion that she was a prostitute?
Yeah, that's true. I mean, she certainly isn't a prostitute, not a word of scripture that would indicate that. And she's clearly the first among the female disciples. She's always listed first in the Bible. She's the only woman who is said to be at the tomb in all four Gospels, grieving over Jesus. In the fourth Gospel, she is the only woman, period. And she's portrayed there as the grieving widow, if you will. And on one occasion in that Gospel, she thinks that she's talking to a gardener, and she says, "Sir, tell me where you have laid his body, and I will go and retrieve it." In Jewish society, for a woman to demand access to the deceased body of a Jewish male was inconceivable unless she was the nearest of kin. So there's some evidence that some hints have been left in the Bible of a relationship that was much closer than we now understand.
Yet the Bible also intimates that the perfect woman is the Virgin Mother.
That's correct. Not quite. The virgin birth story doesn't come into the Christian faith until the 9th decade of the Common Era. You won't find any references to it in the writings of Paul. He wrote from 50 to 64. No reference at all in the first gospel to be written, which is Mark. Indeed, the mother of Jesus is portrayed as someone who doesn't understand Jesus at all, and not supportive in Mark's gospel. She thinks he's out of his mind, and so she goes to put him away in chapters 3 and chapter 6. Well, you know, if you've had an angel appear to you and tell you your baby's going to be born of a virgin, and when he's grown up you think he's mentally ill, there's something sort of incongruent about those two things.
Yes.
But people don't realize that the virgin birth story is a late development in Christian history.
Homosexuality, I mean, the Bible is often referenced as the basis for why these acts are immoral, why these unions should not be sanctioned by the church. How do you see the Bible in relation to same-sex relationships?
Well, in the first place, I don't know why anybody would think that a book written between 1000 BC and 135 AD is definitive on medical or scientific knowledge. You wouldn't go to a doctor who didn't read a medical textbook any later than 135 AD. So the first place, we got to get over the idea that because it's in the Bible, it's true. But even having said that, there are only 9 places in all of the 66 books of the non-apocryphal Bible that have any slight stretch to include homosexuality, and 2 of them are simply a reference to the city of Sodom, and that's not really a condemnation. 3 of them are in Paul's corpus, and he uses the word arsinokoitus, which means a weak man or a man lying. And there are a lot of scholars today that think he was referring to temple prostitutes, though those words get translated into our Bible as sodomite and pervert, and they are thought to be homosexual references, which means there aren't but 4, and they are very shaky. A good lawyer could never win a case on those 4 pieces. There's the Sodom and Gomorrah story, which is really about unwelcoming attitudes. And it shows Lot giving his 2 virgin daughters to be gang raped by the men of Sodom. They don't appear to be homosexual at that moment, but it certainly doesn't appear to be moral. And then it winds up with the story of Lot's 2 daughters seducing their father after they get him drunk and becoming pregnant in an incestuous relationship. Now, how anybody could use that to condemn loving relationships between gay and lesbian people is beyond my comprehension. Then there are 2 references in Leviticus 18 and 20, that are really related. One says it's an abomination, the other says you ought to be put to death for doing it. Well, the first thing I'd say, the literalists don't seem to want to put homosexuals to death today, thank God. I think we've at least gotten that far. Though, you know, we had a Baptist preacher that picketed a funeral of a well-known homosexual named Matthew Shepard with a sign saying, "God said fags should die," see Leviticus 20, and that's sort of the height of negativity. But if you're going to literalize those, you've got to literalize everything in the book of Leviticus, and it means you can be put to death for talking back to your parents, or for worshiping a false god, or for cussing, or for committing adultery. And the executioners, even in Texas, would be working overtime if we were literal about everything in the book of Leviticus. And the last one is Paul in in Romans chapter 1. And that's the strangest argument of all. Paul says in Romans 1 that homosexuality is God's punishment upon people who don't worship God properly. Well, that's a strange God. You know, you better worship me properly, I'll change your sexual orientation.
Perhaps the most shocking thing that you talk about in the book is the link between the scriptures and child abuse.
Yes.
And intimate, in fact, that once you've come to that conclusion, it's a very small step to understanding sexual abuse within the church.
Yes, not only that, I think that's the best section of the book, and it's the one I worked hardest on. There is clearly throughout history an understanding that children are evil and are to be punished.
Spare thy rod, spoil
Spare
thy
the rod
child.
and spoil the child has been used over and over. If you look at the worst abusive cases, they've been in parochial schools, and they've been in church orphanages and things like that. So I think that we sort of encourage that by talking about human life as evil or sinful or broken or distorted, and it becomes the job of the adults to sort of beat them until they get to be good people. A lot of stuff in our history about that. A lot of stories about evangelists, from Billy Graham to Billy Sunday to all the well-known evangelists. And if you read their stories, you'll all find that they were beaten severely as children. Now, what comes out of that is an image of God as a punishing parent. And so much of the Christian faith shows human beings sort of quaking in their boots before the judgmental God who's going to punish them with the fires of hell forever. It's not far removed from a quivering kid standing before a schoolmaster that's going to beat him to within an inch of his life. And I think we need to understand that. And the sexual abuse, there's another dimension to the sexual abuse in that part of the church has said you can't be a priest unless you deny all sexual ideas yourself. You've got to suppress them all because celibacy is the rule. I think that attracts into the priesthood people who are distorted and not healthy in some of their understandings of sexuality. So you've got a lot of other dimensions.
Well, let's talk about that, because you're not a heretic or an agnostic. I mean, you are a believer. I mean, fundamentalists look at the Bible as the Word of God.
They're wrong.
You say you are tremendously inspired by the story of Jesus.
Yes.
I mean, how are we to read the Bible, given...
Well, you're not to read it literally. I think you take the Bible as it is, but you do not worship it. You recognize that it starts in a tribal God, in a tribal world, hating everybody that you hate. And it grows. It grows through the prophets. It grows through the figure of Jesus. It grows into a kind of universal consciousness. And I think the way you tell the story of Jesus is to see him as an expression of the love of God that empowers you to become more fully human, so that you don't have to spend your time putting down someone else so that you'll feel secure. That's where prejudice comes from. That's where racism comes from. That's where sexism comes from. That's where homophobia comes from. The overwhelming mentality of conservative religion is to oppose homosexual people by quoting the Bible. But the fact is that the movement for justice and full inclusion of gay and lesbian people is also deeply rooted in the Christian faith. I'm a part of that. I've been fighting for the rights of gay people in America for a quarter of a century, and my church has finally ordained and consecrated an openly gay bishop in the state of New Hampshire.
But I want to talk about that, because your church is deeply divided over this. I mean, I grew up in the United Church in Canada, very progressive, very liberal. They seem to be losing congregations, while the fundamentalists seem to be on the rise.
I think that's correct. It's true in America. The mainline churches are in a free fall. The fundamentalist churches are rising. The other thing that's rising that the church doesn't seem to notice is the growth of what I call the Church Alumni Association. That is, the two biggest movements in Western religion today are a movement back toward the certainties of yesterday and a movement totally out of any kind of religious orientation whatsoever. And I think they play on each other, because the more fundamentalist the church gets, the less thinking people can be a part of that. And so if you don't offer them another alternative, they say, well, you know, your God's not big enough to be God for the world in which I live, and so I'm going to just depart. I don't want to be identified with that anymore. So I find myself a deeply committed believer. I'm almost a mystic in my understanding of God's presence. But I find that the words that we've used over the centuries aren't terribly helpful in helping me to articulate what it is that I believe I experience as the reality of God.
which causes me to think that we are in a position where we've got to either change or die. There's no middle ground. You can't just close your mind and perpetuate yesterday's patterns. But what are you going to change into? Most people aren't willing to change until they get some vision of what the new thing is going to be. They won't give up the old one. And so I think that's where we are as a Christian church. I think we're in the place where a massive new reformation is going to come into the Christian faith. And it probably will not come until the right-wing religious conservatism gets harder and harder and harder, and more people are alienated from it. And then the hearts of human beings will begin to ache for some sense of the transcendent or the divine that they experience as real, but they can't articulate in the old formulas.
John Shelby Spong, I want to thank you very much for joining me. It's been a real pleasure.
It's always a pleasure to be with you. Thank you for having me.
I have great admiration for a man who can quote Gerd Ludemann and Tom Wright in the same presentation. They represent sort of the extremes in biblical scholarship. Dr. Craig has used a trick, that's an incorrect word. He's used, what shall I say? He's done the same thing that politicians do. He says, everybody thinks of it my way. Most scholars, he said a number of times, do this. Most scholars do that. Well, he and I must read a totally different group of scholars. I'm a member of the Jesus Seminar. We have 250 PhD Bible scholars, Catholic and Protestant, and they would not agree at all with either the timing that Dr. Craig mentioned or with some of his historicity of such things as the tomb, the empty tomb. When you read biblical material, you're not always reading primary sources. We know for a fact that Matthew copied Mark into his gospel. Matthew copies about 90% of Mark into his gospel. We know that Luke also had Mark in front of him when he wrote, so Luke copies about half of Mark into his gospel. So when Matthew, Mark, and Luke agree, it's no mystery. They have the same source. Mark is the primary source for all of them. Let me suggest that our dating system would be quite different. Paul, in my dating scheme, would write between 50 and 64. I assume that you would agree probably with that. But when we get past that, I would date Mark after 70. I would date Matthew in the mid-80s. I would date Luke the late 80s, maybe even the early 90s. And I've never seen anybody that suggested that Acts was as early as Dr. Craig has suggested. Indeed, if you read people like Burton Mack, you'll find that he dates Acts way in the 2nd century.